We are very privileged this evening to have Anatole Kaletsky speak to us. And Anatole and I go back quite a long way. We were both at King's College in the 70s, where Anatole studied mathematics and got a first. And then you went to Harvard as a Kennedy Memorial Scholar and got a master's degree in economics. After that, you became, of course, a famous journalist. You wrote for the Economist, Financial Times, and the Times of London, which I think you were the economics editor. Mm-hmm. And then you moved on to join Reuters and the Herald Tribune. You're also an economic consultant, and you've co-established Capitalism, which is a consultancy. You were appointed chairman of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and you're still chairman?
Actually, I stepped down last year. Adair Turner has taken over from me as chairman.
Okay, right.
And he's turned it into a real job, which he even gets paid for, which I didn't.
Well, as I understand it, it has $200 million in grants, so it's quite well funded. I guess they can afford good salaries. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk about was the global financial crisis really a debt crisis, and drawing, I think, on your book, Capitalism 4. So I now hand over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Adam. For me, it's much more of an honor for me to be invited to speak here in Oxford than the other way around. But it's also a great and unusual pleasure for me to be able to talk to, particularly to such a large and I'm sure expert and knowledgeable audience, but about not about what's going on this week or yesterday in the financial markets, which is actually how I make my living, and it's jolly interesting. But I thought I would seize on this opportunity to discuss the state of the past, and to some extent perhaps the outlook for the global economy and political economy, and with specific reference, I realize what this seminar is about, to financial regulation, but to discuss it in a much more long-term perspective in the light, as Adam says, of the crisis, which is now 7 years ago, but is still far from having played out its full effects, either on the world economy or, more importantly, in the context of what I'm going to say, in the way we understand the global economy and the interaction between economics and politics does work and should work. So that's broadly going to be the subject of what I plan to talk about now. But as you've been kind enough to provide me with so much time, not many hedge funds have an hour and a half or an hour and three quarters to talk about the state of the world. I'd also be very happy in the discussion in three quarters of an hour time to perhaps play more to my comparative advantage, which is what's going on in the world today. So I'd be very happy. In fact, I'd love to respond to your ideas and concerns about what may be going on in China or the oil market or whatever. But I would like to start off, as I say, to take advantage of this opportunity to look at things at a longer, in terms of longer perspective, and really go back to some of the ideas that I discussed now 5 years ago in this book that Adam mentioned, called Capitalism 4.0. Now, this book, if I flatter myself, I would say it did reasonably well, but not all that well. But if I flatter myself, I would say it was ahead of its time. But of course, being ahead of your time is often a euphemism for being plain wrong. But I think in some ways, a lot of what I discussed there in terms of the restructuring of the management of the global economy and the relationship between the financial and macroeconomic system and the regulatory and ideological structures that surround and underpin those, I think in some ways many of these ideas are even more relevant today than they were 5 years ago. So for those I'm sure of a tiny minority in this room who may have seen that book or read some of it. I apologize if I repeat myself, but I think a number of the points that I made there, as I say, 5 or 6 years ago, are actually even more relevant today. And my argument in the book really was that especially back in 2009-10, but even today, it was very easy and tempting, but actually not very interesting to say, well, greedy bankers and incompetent regulators and gullible borrowers were to blame for this, unprecedented collapse of the financial system. But I think what was more interesting, it is more interesting then, and ultimately actually more useful from a socio-political standpoint, is to try to understand the crisis that occurred in 2008 in a broader historical and even ideological perspective. And I think the first step in doing that is to recognize that capitalism was never a perfect system for organizing the economy and society, and nobody should ever have believed, or could on any rational basis have believed that. It's in fact a very imperfect and a deficient system in both economic and, importantly, in moral terms. As Adam Smith was among the first to explain, but it is the best system that we've come up with, or, to adapt Churchill's comments, it's the worst system apart from, the comment about democracy. It's probably the worst system of organizing the economy apart from all the others. It's the best or the least worst because it allows experimentation, adaptation, and evolution in a way that other more rigid systems don't. And what's crucial, and I think this is what was, particularly emerged from the crisis, is that the system itself is part of the experiment that has to adapt and evolve. And it's almost like a living species. It adapts in response to a changing environment and makes itself more functional through a series of evolutionary transformations which are typically provoked by financial and political crises. It's only through financial and political crises that the system changes. And I think that's exactly what happened, especially with hindsight, to the world in 2007-8. A lot of people at the time said, oh, the world's coming to an end. But in fact, it's very clear that capitalism didn't come to an end. Nobody expects any longer that the global system is about to collapse, whatever that might mean. But the system's survival doesn't imply that the pre-crisis faith in the dogma of perfect financial markets and the absolute efficiency of free enterprise will ever again be what it was before the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. Something is therefore in the process of replacing this market fundamentalist view of looking at the financial world and global capitalism. And the question is, what will it be? Well, it seems to me that the answer is now pretty clear. Global financial capitalism is going to be replaced by global financial capitalism, but of a different kind. And the interesting question now, and I think we can begin to observe this over the last 5 or 6 years, is what are the characteristics, of this new system that is emerging? But I think we mustn't forget that it is fundamentally, and whatever replaces it, almost anywhere in the world, and regardless of whether it's in democracies or in centralized autocracies like China, what replaces the capitalism that did fall apart in 2007-8 is going to be another form of capitalism. I think the only thing that would change that would be if there was some mechanism for removing the fundamental urges that have always underlaying the capitalist system. And perhaps I'm especially talking to a serious academic audience like this, I should be... Sorry, I should modify slightly what I say. And really, I'm not even talking about a capitalist system. I'm talking about a market system. What are the fundamental human urges that underlay a market system of truck and barter, as Adam Smith described it? It's ambition, acquisitiveness, and the competitive spirit. And you see these arising wherever attempts have been made over the last centuries to replace the market system or capitalism. Always competition, acquisitiveness, individualism, ambition break out. They break through the surface of whatever whatever we attempt to overlay to control them. And I think unless these fundamental human instincts are removed by, from the gene pool by some form of genetic engineering, whatever follows every breakdown of a market capitalist system is going to be a market capitalism of another kind. So once we recognize that capitalism or the market is here to stay, but at the same time, it's not some static set of institutions in permanent equilibrium, but a system that's constantly reinventing itself. I think we can see the events of 2007-9 in a completely different light from the one that was presented at the time, and is still, I think, dominates the discussions of what went wrong and what should be done to fix it 5 years later. Now, specifically, what I say in my book is that the crisis of 2007-9, which I think is still carrying on in various forms, as we'll come back to, marked the fourth systemic transformation of the global capitalist system, which I date, but the history I'm using is very, very superficial. It's very simplistic, because what I'm doing is what economists do all the time, is I'm creating a very, very oversimplified model to try to understand what's going on. I think that's just as valid. In fact, it's rather more valid, in history than it is in, a lot of the macroeconomics, where models really are ridiculously oversimplified and completely at odds with reality. The model I've suggested is certainly doesn't capture reality, but I think it's sort of broadly consistent with the reality of the last a few hundred years. So what I suggest is that since I dated to 1776, the creation of modern capitalism, modern market economy. Why 1776? It's a nice year because it happened to be the year when the Wealth of Nations was founded, and also the American Declaration of Independence, which sort of created the first, if you like, self-consciously capitalist, bourgeois state. So going back to that, and of course you can trace the origins of markets and all that kind of thing, not just hundreds but thousands of years back. But going back to that, what I suggest is that there have been 4 phases, each one punctuated by a series of crises. Now, as I say, this is very oversimplified, but basically, what I felt was that there was one very long period, the first century, if you like, of what I called classical capitalism. Now, really, that should probably be broken up into the sort of the pre-Jevons, pre-marginalist period, the Adam Smith-Ricardo period, followed in the 1870s by the Manchester Liberal period. But I don't want to go into that, and I called my book Capitalism 4.0. It could have just as well been 5.0 or 6.0, but let's keep it simple. So the first 100 years I don't know much about, but it is pretty clear that period came very decisively to an end in the early part of the 20th century with the events that started arguably with the First World War, but really with the Russian Revolution, a complete breakdown there in Russia, and then perhaps sort of climaxed in 1929 or to 1932 with the complete breakdown of the most successful and advanced capitalist economy, classical capitalist economy that the world saw at the time, the world had ever seen, the United States. So that was the first phase. Then you had what I described as the second phase, which, if you like, the mixed economy, Keynesian view of the world, which started in the 1930s, the wartime economy, a great interaction between markets and governments playing a very, very big role in the running of the economy in a way that could not even have been conceived in the 19th century, by the most radical anti-capitalist, or by most of the radical anti-capitalist critics. And that actually worked extremely well after the Second World War. And you had this golden age in the 1950s and 60s of Keynesian mixed economy capitalism, which arguably was the most successful period of economic history ever. But that actually also broke down in a crisis. The crisis there began, you could argue it began in 68, with the social turbulence in Europe and America and so on, but certainly culminated, from a financial and economic standpoint in 74-5, in what was certainly the worst financial crisis of the second half of the 20th century, in many ways as bad as 1929 for many financial institutions, and the great inflation. What came after that? And then there was a long period of transition, of uncertainty, just as there was between 1917 and the early 30s, when Keynesian economics got developed. And what came after that was a third phase, which was as different from the second as the second was from the first. What emerged from 1979 onwards, really, with first Margaret Thatcher, and then much more importantly, with Reaganomics in the United States, was another version of capitalism, which was clearly a market economy, arguably more of a market economy than the 1930s, but that was also a market economy, but was completely different, as different, as I say in my book, as you can recognize that a cat and a tiger are part of the same genus, but they're as different from each other. So then you have the third phase, the market fundamentalist phase, if you like, that came from emerged out of the crisis of 74 to 79, the inflationary crisis. And that also worked, by its own standards, extremely well after an initial period of instability, political turmoil and so on, but worked remarkably well for about 20 or 25 years. But and to some extent, my approach is a somewhat Marxist one, the previous two versions, that ultimately succumbed to its own contradictions, and that's what we saw in 2007, 2008, in the breakdown of financial system. So that's where, and this, I think, is or was, and perhaps still is, a crisis not just in capitalism, but a crisis of capitalism comparable to the 1920s and 1930s, which changed the system, the 1970s and 1980s, which completely changed the system, and now we're on to the fourth iteration. Now, from this point of view, I think we can see the transformation of many of the institutional arrangements that have been made inevitable by the crisis, not as the death of capitalism in the same way that the crumbling of the Berlin Wall really did mean the death of communism, but merely another step change in this long-term evolutionary process. And if we look at the crisis in this historical perspective, I think we get some advantages in trying to analyze what's going on and what's likely to come. First, I think we can see that the great boom-bust cycle of the 10 years before the crisis was not just a random, crazy episode of mass hysteria or dishonesty and immorality in the way that or incompetence, as in the way that is often presented, but actually a fairly rational and, in some ways, at least with hindsight, predictable process whereby market forces responded to several very powerful political economic trends that began in the late 1980s and then just extrapolated them too far in the way that financial markets are a habit of doing. And the ones that I would highlight, obviously, was the breakdown of communism, the emergence of Asia as a major part of the world economy, the revolution in computing and communication technology, which was very much part of the story between 1980 and 2007. And last, and I would say in some ways most importantly, the creation really for the first time in 5,000 years of recorded history of a global economic system based on a pure paper money that was not backed by gold, silver, slaves, cowrie shells, or any other external, God-given standard of value. And that's really something that only emerged with the breakdown of first the Bretton Woods system in 1972, then the breakdown of various attempts to peg currencies or monetary emission to external anchors of various kinds, and finally in the late 1990s, this idea of money of central banks as a completely free, a completely independent player, not constrained by anything other than their own internally set inflation targets in terms of what they can do. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, these powerful and generally benign trends actually, for a while, rightly inspired optimism among investors as well as businesses and consumers, both about the rate of growth of the world economy and also about its stability, as implied by the phrase the Great Moderation, because the removal of any external constraints on monetary policy really did allow, for a long time, a great moderating effect from macroeconomic policy of broadly the kind that Keynes had advocated, but actually much more effective and much more powerful because it was able to use not just fiscal policy but monetary policy with a freedom and flexibility that I think even Keynes was never able fully to anticipate because, writing in the 1930s and even thinking about it in the subsequent decade, it was very hard for anybody to believe that you could have a monetary system that was completely independent of gold or dollars or any other external standard of value. So for a while, it gave central banks this enormous ability, an unprecedented ability to stabilize the world, and financial markets and businesses, and I think consumers, homeowners, and so on, rightly recognized this and responded to it. So this optimism really led fairly naturally and inevitably, in the way that Hyman Minsky and many others and George Soros have described, to speculative excesses, producing a typical financial boom-bust cycle. And this is a sort of pattern that's, this isn't the first time in history this happened. This is exactly the sort of pattern that has been seen many times before in eras of major technological and geopolitical breakthroughs. You could argue, certainly going back to tulip mania, which had which was a symptom not just of the insanity of people worshipping tulips, but it was a symptom of the rise of the Low Countries to become the wealthiest and most economically powerful, previously obscure and irrelevant nation, suddenly becoming the wealthiest and most economically powerful nation in the world. And then after that, the South Sea Bubble, which was in a way a similar reaction to England's or Britain's growing control of the transatlantic and prospective control of the transatlantic trade, which by any standards, in the long run, was a greater justification for projecting long-term economic profitability than anything that had happened before. So we've had this over-extrapolation of good news turning into boom-bust cycles many times. So what was it that turned a perfectly normal, if rather severe, boom-bust cycle into this almost unprecedented financial disaster? I think it wasn't the scale of the bubble or the morality of the people or immorality involved in it, both of which were actually quite limited in comparison with other episodes, such as in terms of the scale of speculation, for example, in property in the United States was actually quite small compared with a bubble economy in Japan. And yet, the bubble economy in Japan devastated the Japanese economy, but it didn't really do very much damage to the rest of the world. So what turned this into an unprecedented disaster wasn't really excessive borrowing by consumers or homos or unprecedented greed among bankers and investors. This greed, it's like the poor, it's always been with us and always will be. I think what turned it into a disaster was a misinterpretation of economic theory as a fundamentalist, almost religious doctrine. The doctrine that rational and efficient markets are always right and will return to equilibrium if regulators and governments stand back. Now, this doctrine was adopted, obviously, by Alan Greenspan in America, but also by the Bank of England and the Treasury, and especially, and with the zeal of a convert, actually, by our instinctively socialist chancellor, here in Britain, Gordon Brown. But then, with much more disastrous results in 2007-8, it really dominated the Bush administration's response to the crisis, and particularly the US Treasuries. The decision not to put a safety net under the collapse of, to make an example of one financial institution, Lehman Brothers, having bailed out the previous ones, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But rather than pick over the past and apportion blame, what I want to do is look at how the failure of that one financial institution really affects what's going on and our understanding of what comes ahead. I think the clearest consequence of the crisis, which, after all, within 24 hours, the US government completely reversed its position. So it allowed Lehman Brothers to go bust. Within 24 hours, it then bailed out AIG, a far bigger institution, because it realized that if it didn't bail out AIG, though every other financial institution, not just in America, but in the world, would inevitably collapse. Now, they could have made that same judgment 24 hours earlier about Lehman Brothers. They could have nationalized it, fired all the, imprisoned all the directors, done whatever they want. And then I think what we would have seen would have been a recession, a financial crisis, but just a common or garden financial crisis, not something so spectacular. Within 24 hours, they reversed, but by then it was too late. 24 hours, this is a path-dependent process, and it was, the way I often put it, it was only a small step forward, but usually if you take a small step forward, you can then take a small step back and reverse yourself. But if you're standing on the edge of a cliff, a small step forward turns into a very big and irreversible change. And that's exactly what Lehman was. So what does all this imply for what's going on now and in the future? Well, I think the clearest consequence of the crisis, which we can now see looking back, is really a transformed relationship between markets and public policy, and what it is assumed, even by conservative analysts and experts like Alan Greenspan himself, to be an appropriate relationship between markets and public policy and government. And I take that view partly because I think, going back to my little sort of oversimplified historical model, 4 phases of capitalism, it's because the relationship between government and markets has actually, I think, been the key difference between each of these phases. So again, very much oversimplifying the way I see it. And in 19th century capitalism, you had markets here, the economy here, governments, and the political system here, and really there was very little interaction between them, except the governments had to raise a certain amount of tax to fight wars, and they were under a certain amount of economically driven political influence to maintain privileges and monopolies of certain groups. But there was never really much idea that the two had a natural interaction. Now, the big change that occurred in the 1920s and 1930s was the realization that actually markets can't be trusted, the economic system can't be trusted, and you need government to intervene in quite a big way within something that is still a market system, but that you need a completely different relationship where, broadly speaking, the government is trusted and dominant, the market is necessary but distrusted and takes a subordinate position in the sort of big thrust of development of the system. So there was a distrust of markets and a faith in benign, omniscient governments from the 1930s onwards. Now, in the third phase of capitalism, if you think about it, defined by the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, these prejudices were exactly reversed. Now the markets were always right and the governments were always wrong. And that was the big change. The two interact, unlike in the 19th century, but the interaction has always got to be with the markets, overriding whatever might be the sort of wrongly motivated political decisions made by governments. So therefore, I think, at least from my point of view, it's quite natural and reasonable to think, well, what will be the fourth phase? How will the fourth phase differ in terms of this relationship between markets and governments? Well, in the first phase, as I said, we had markets and governments operating almost completely in isolation with each other. Then we had a period when the markets were wrong and the governments were right. Next, from the 1970s onwards, we had a period where the markets were always right and the governments were always wrong. Well, now, what happened after 2007 or 2008 onwards, that the world had to acknowledge really an awful sounding truth, that actually the markets and the governments could both be catastrophically wrong. So they were both wrong. Now that may sound terribly depressing, but actually acknowledging fallibility in both markets and political institutions doesn't need to be paralyzing. In fact, it can be rather empowering, because fallibility obviously implies the capacity for improvement, both in economics and in politics. And being a little bit more abstract from an economic standpoint, dealing with imperfect knowledge, which is what actually the really interesting aspects of economics are all about, requires a collaboration between pure economic analysis and political inputs, instead of this adversarial relationship that actually built up both in the second phase, in the Keynesian phase, if you like, and in the certainly in the third phase, the Thatcher-Reagan phase. So acknowledging this fallibility in both markets and governments is also reassuring in a more immediate and practical sense, because it reminds us that boom-bust cycles, recessions, and financial crises are something that is actually perfectly natural, predictable, and survivable in economic life. I mean, they have always happened, so we shouldn't, stand back in horror and say the world cannot cope. It obviously can cope, and it actually has coped, even if not as well as it might have done. So now what I'd like to do in the last 15, 20 minutes is consider a bit more specifically what I think are some of the emerging trends of this interaction between markets and governments, based on a recognition that they're both highly imperfect. If the world is too complex and unpredictable for either governments or markets to be perfect mechanisms for achieving social objectives, what's the logical response? Well, it seems to me that it's to devise a system of checks and balances that reflect both private incentives and public interests, but also to recognize that they're going to have to constantly be adapted and changed in the light of events. And that's, this is what brings us to the issues of financial regulation, pragmatic macroeconomic policy, and so on. So what I'd like to do is just give a few examples of what I think is happening and has been happening over the last few years, which at least in some senses can be understood in the light of this broad framework that I've suggested. And I'll talk a bit about economic policy, a bit about financial regulation, a bit about politics as well. So starting with economic policy, if this new phase, post-crisis phase of capitalism, is marked by a recognition that market economies can't function without competent and active government, what does that mean? Well, the most obvious implication is in the financial sector, which I'll come back to in a minute. But there's another essential economic function of government that's been demonstrated even more clearly in the last few years, and that is that governments and central banks must actively manage economic cycles and inflation targets, which were believed for 30 years to be a necessary and sufficient answer for all macroeconomic uncertainties, are clearly not enough. Now, the dominant economic theories of the 1980s, as those of you here who are economists will know better than I, started off, although they adapted from this, but they started off from the assumption that efficient markets tend automatically towards equilibrium with full employment, and that left really only one important role for government policy, and that was to keep inflation predictably under control. The rest could be left to market competition. That was, the big counter-revolution, that characterized the transition from the Keynesian second phase to the Thatcher-Reagan third phase. But if financial cycles, banking crises, and self-reinforcing slumps are now recognized as natural features of the market system, then, again, as they were in the 1930s, or from the 1930s onwards, then governments, central banks must again accept the broad responsibilities they abandoned, really, from 1918 onwards, for managing growth and employment and maintaining financial stability, all at the same time as keeping inflation under control. So the idea that they're only responsible for one thing is no longer acceptable, and we can see this obviously spreading all over the world. As a result, the fashion for central banks to focus on inflation targets is already being replaced by a broader range of objectives, but there is still a great deal of uncertainty and a great deal of hypocrisy about these objectives, because central bankers, even today, are still operating intellectually within a framework that they inherited from the 1980s and 90s. So even when they are clearly pursuing financial stability objectives, or when they're clearly pursuing an unemployment or a real GDP or nominal GDP growth target, they have to pretend that what they're doing is trying to get inflation up to 2% or up to 1.5%, that it's all about inflation. Their behavior, and actually talking to them privately, makes it pretty clear that that's not what they're doing, but the ideology still requires them to pursue a single-minded inflation target, which is actually both irrational from an economic theory standpoint, but also quite destabilizing and dangerous from a financial market and business standpoint, because it means that what the central bankers and governments behind them are doing is not actually reflected in what they claim to be doing, thereby causing more uncertainty, more confusion and expectations, rather than taking advantage of, the limited validity that theories of rational expectation have, which is that if you can create a reasonable expectation of something and get people to behave in accordance with it, then you have more chance, at least for a while, of restoring stability. So but nevertheless, if you look at what central banks are doing, and this is the crucial change that has occurred over the last 5 years, as opposed to what they're saying, it's pretty clear that they are no longer merely aiming to hit a 2% inflation target, as in the case of the Bank of England, but what they're doing is that they're setting tolerance ranges for inflation, unemployment, and financial risks, and then using techniques to some extent similar to control engineering, to prevent the economy moving into dangerous territory by focusing on whichever economics variables are flashing red at any particular point in the cycle. Now that is as I said, is a perfectly rational way of evolving. I think ultimately that will become the explicit objective of government policy, but during the transition period, when you're still operating on an outdated and invalid economic theory, and this is what the Institute for New Economic Theory, the New Economic Thinking that Adam mentioned to some extent, is about. If you're operating on an outdated economic ideology, the confusion generated by the contradiction between the theory ideology on the one hand and the practice on the other is highly destabilizing, and I think that's where we are right today, and literally more so than ever, perhaps this month, because now this confusion has spread from US, Japan, Europe, and now it's in China, which is, of course, much more opaque, and it's much harder to understand what's going on. But nevertheless, I think this is clearly this control engineering approach to macroeconomic policy, I think, is emerging. Now, one reason I think why this is emerging is because of the transformation in politics that's also implied by this new model of capitalism I'm talking about. The expanding involvement of governments in economic management and financial regulation might have suggested that the public sector would grow larger and larger. But actually the opposite has been happening. The size of the public sector has not grown at all. And therefore what governments have had to do is, if they wanted to have more influence on economic cycles, is to use instruments like extremely low interest rates much more aggressively than before, and to adopt these control engineering type of models, pulling and pushing the levers that they have, not necessarily the levers that are most effective. But I just wanted to say a few words about what I think politics, how politics, I think, has changed in terms of the size of government. So you would have thought that maybe all I'm talking about really is a reversion to the 1950s and 1960s, more government, big government, an interventionist state, and so on and so forth. But that's clearly not happening. It hasn't happened in the last 5 years, and all the trends suggest that it's not going to happen in the future. Now, why is it? I think there are two fairly obvious reasons. The first is simply that as a result of the crisis, governments ran out of money, or appeared to run out of money, on conventional accounting standards bequeathed by previous generations of economists, just because of the loss of tax revenues resulting from the crisis. Particularly the health and pension promises made by successive governments became much more unsustainable, or became unsustainable much earlier than they would have done anyway for demographic reasons, perhaps in the next 2 decades. So the fiscal crises that emerged, or apparent fiscal crises that emerged, really, they happened, as I say, 10, 15 years earlier than the aging baby boom generation on its own would have dictated, and they really prevented the Keynesian response of more government spending, bigger deficits, which might have been a perfectly rational response and would have been, if you like, a throwback to the 50s and 60s. But I think the second reason that we haven't had simply a return to Keynesian economics is that the fundamental reassessment of this relationship between government and business that's now going on has suggested, or really revealed, that governments really can't, in the long run, satisfy an advanced society's complex demands for healthcare, education, and personalized retirement planning. It's not just a matter of the amounts, it's the amount of the ability, it's a question of the ability to do it. So, as I said earlier, we don't believe in markets anymore, but we don't believe in governments either. We don't believe in Whitehall knows best. And the result of that is that there is less and less willingness to trust top-down government in dealing with these extremely important sectors of the economy. And the thing that has struck me over the last few years, thinking about, healthcare, retirement, and these huge drains on the public purse, is that these are really the commanding heights of the economy. In the 1940s and 50s, the dream of socialism was to take over the commanding heights of the economy, which were coal, steel, and railroads. Well, nobody wants coal, steel, and railroads, but the commanding heights of the economy of the future, that we're in now, are health, education, pensions provision, dealing with demographics. Between them, they probably take up roughly 40% of national income. So we have a system where actually, even after the crisis, governments are responsible for these huge sectors, far more important actually than coal, steel, and railroads ever were. but we no longer trust them to do that. And I think that's created a big tension in the ability of governments to manage the economy. So now let me move on to financial regulation. I have another whole section about direct democracy and how alarming some of those trends are, but I think I'll skip that. So next, let me say something about financial regulation, which is, I guess, what I was really supposed to be speaking about all along anyway. Well, the most obvious lesson from the crisis was that a capitalist financial system ultimately depends on the financial system as well as the macroeconomic stability system, but the financial system specifically ultimately depends on government support, especially, and that's much more true in a world of pure fiat money, even than it is in a world where money is related to something, because it's only the government that gives meaning to fiat money. And maybe we can have a debate about Bitcoin later on if you want to, but I think there's no evidence at all that Bitcoin or anything like that actually can or is showing any signs of functioning as a form of money. So what we definitely learned in 2008, as I said, is that even if the government support is withdrawn for just 24 hours, that can lead to complete the collapse of the system. Now, the conclusion, though, that politicians and central bankers and most academic economists, who I think really ought to know better, have drawn from the experience, is that actually we need to change the financial system so that it no longer will depend on government support. I think that is a profoundly wrong conclusion, because I think that's asking pigs to fly. The claim is, and I know a lot of prominent people in Oxford who have been very much behind this view of promoting this view of the world. The claim is that future banking crises like 2008 can be avoided by breaking up banks that are too big to fail and by dividing finance into casino and utility functions. Now, I think that all this talk about breaking up banks and closing down city casinos is basically a populist distraction from the real issue, which is that you can't have a market financial system without a government safety net, a political government safety net behind it. And incidentally, morally, it also has turned actually into a distraction from the activities of individuals that has acted in the interest of bank managements, although not in the interest of bank shareholders. So what's wrong with this idea that we can get away from casino banking, or divide casino and utility banking, and get away from too big to fail? Well, I think the evidence of the crisis is pretty clear. Northern Rock and HBOS were both pure utility banks, and they suffered the worst losses in the crisis. The worst problems, certainly in Britain, had nothing to do with casino banks. They were all with the pure utility banks. And actually, and certainly Northern Rock, and arguably even HBOS, would not have been included in any danger zone that was considered too big to fail. On the other hand, looking in America, Lehman and Bear Stearns were pure casino banks, and again, they certainly wouldn't have been classified as too big to fail, but their failure was enough to undermine the more or less pure utility banks, or potentially undermine the pure utility banks in the US. Meanwhile, many of the institutions that actually performed best in the crisis, or at least survived the crisis, and actually helped to bail out the failing casinos and simple utility banks, institutions like JP Morgan, HSBC, BNP and France, were exactly the kind of diversified too big to fail banks that the current conventional wisdom wants to eliminate and break up. So what do I think then was the real financial problem, and how could it be solved? Well, I think that this alternative way of thinking about an evolution of capitalism and the relationship between government and markets offers one, I think, quite useful approach to these questions. If we acknowledge that markets are not always right, then we have to, then the implication is that the price signals that are generated by competitive markets can sometimes be catastrophically wrong, even in the absence of any overt signs of market failure. And that's particularly true. So even if there isn't corruption, lack of competition, poor regulation, you can still have catastrophically wrong signals generated by markets based on the best information available both to the private sector and to government regulators at the time. And that's particularly true of financial markets because they deal in a commodity whose value is intrinsically unknowable, namely what happens in the future. And if you acknowledge, therefore, that markets and regulators are both unreliable and prone to error, what's to be done? Well, as I said earlier, it's to create a system of checks and balances. I think the conclusion is that financial markets can't operate in a world that's neatly separated from public policy, in which regulators just set broad rules and then stand back and leave private financial institutions to respond to price signals and incentives that they themselves create. The politics and economics can't be compartmentalized in that way. What we need to do is recognize that whatever the system of regulations and capital structures, there will be times, maybe only once in a generation, when banks will require and will obtain, regardless of what the rules and the laws are, they will require and will obtain unlimited government support, regardless of whatever was said ex ante. Why the special role for governments? Because governments and central banks have the unique power to raise taxes and print money without limit in defense of the financial system, just as armies and police forces have the unique right to use violence in defense of property and laws. In my view, therefore, the right approach is not to pretend that the interdependence is some kind of, between government and finance, is some kind of pathological aberration that can overcome by new regulations, but rather to accept that open-ended government guarantees in extreme conditions will be there, and then work out mechanisms for banks, their employees, and their customers to pay for this insurance in advance. By adopting this philosophy, taxpayer interests can be protected, as can government revenues, and we can avoid the excessive regulation that stifle all financial innovation or treat finance as a completely unproductive parasitic activity, which I think is wrong, even though it's something that my successor at INET, Adair Turner, has made a big issue of his. The fact is that finance, and particularly borrowing, is clearly necessary for the smooth functioning of markets. One of the reasons that I think that the recovery from the global depression of 2007-8 has been so weak, despite the extremely low interest rates and large government deficits and so on, one of the main reasons has been the over-regulation of finance and the difficulties in obtaining credit, not for homeowners, but for businesses, and we see that especially in Europe. But finance also has a social function, which is actually more progressive than regressive. Finance and the deregulation of finance in the 80s, and one of the reasons that the Thatcher and Reagan revolution turned out to be so politically successful is that the deregulation of finance allows large amounts of capital to flow from the high income to the low income portions of society. Now, you might argue, and people like Piketty have done, we can discuss this in a minute, I'm going to stop in about 3 minutes, that this is not the best means of that there are better, it should be, that there are and should be better means of redistributing income and wealth, and that they will have to be developed. But in the absence of the political consensus that is required to create those means of wealth and income redistribution, flow finance, borrowing, especially borrowing at extremely low interest rates, which is the world that we're now in, is actually a socially progressive, in my view, rather than socially regressive force. So, finally, just a few examples of how I think this can be done, and then I'll stop. Well, I think once we cross the ideological Rubicon of conceding that public guarantees for banks under certain circumstances can't be avoided, I think the answers are fairly clear. You need pre-funded insurance mechanisms, liquidity rules that require banks to buy up trillions of pounds and dollars and euros of public debt, and that's actually to a certain extent what quantitative easing has been about, and much simpler, and this is what has absolutely failed, and much simpler capital structures for banks that make clear in advance which liabilities will be guaranteed by the governments and which will not be. For example, say deposits with maturities up to 12 months should be guaranteed unconditionally and without limit, while other liabilities are all treated as equity, enjoying no protection at all. That would be one dividing line. But there has to be a clear dividing line. And what has happened over the last 3 years is actually we've moved in the opposite direction. I think that's been a mistake, which ultimately will have to be reversed if and when I'm right in believing that this period of sort of post-crisis transition will eventually come to an end and will emerge into a couple of decades of sort of calmer waters, more like the late 80s and 90s and the late 50s and 60s rather than the crisis period. But why has this happened? Why instead of greater clarity have we had greater confusion? Well, partly because there is still an ideological, I think largely ideological, rejection of this idea that actually you can't separate private financial markets from politically motivated government, but also because of I think, a behavioral sort of dysfunction among central bankers. Central bankers hate the idea of offering clarity about public guarantees because they believe that constructive ambiguity about public support helps to eliminate or reduce moral hazard. This was a big point of Mervyn King's. He was obsessed with moral hazard. If we give clarity, then everybody will take advantage. But in reality, I think this was, Mervyn was a very good central bank in some ways, but he made some very, very bad mistakes as well. And I think his view on moral hazard was not just slightly off, it was actually the opposite of the truth. Deliberate ambiguity is actually exactly what creates moral hazard. As Ben Bernanke famously said back in 2008, there are no atheists in a foxhole. When you're in the middle of a crisis, you do what's necessary. So in a systemic crisis, no government or central bank will renege on any implicit guarantee, even if it hasn't been formalized in legislation. And therefore, all bank liabilities that might conceivably be guaranteed end up being guaranteed in a systemic crisis. That's what we saw in 2008, most spectacularly in Ireland, but actually, pretty much spreading around the world. And it's only when the crisis is over that you start, getting these bail-ins and, depositors being, or in situations where you have such a small component of the global system like Cyprus, where you decide to make an example and punish the depositors in the hope of setting an example to others. But actually, that example will not work if there's another systemic crisis. And by the time that there is a systemic crisis, it becomes too late to force bank shareholders, customers and employees who are going to get this guarantee to pay the proper price for the insurance that they should have been paying, over the previous 10, 20, 30 years. So that, I think, is, those are some of the specific ways that I think this worldview about capitalism is changing and is going to change public decisions. Let me just right at the end say, though, that all this stuff about finance and macroeconomics and so on pales into insignificance in comparison with the greatest challenges of all, which are really in international relations, about the management of the global environment, international trade, and the shifting balance of power between the advanced economies and the developing world. As the world concludes that although market forces are the best and the only mechanism for spreading wealth around the world, it's equally obvious that energy and environmental policy, trade imbalances, currency relationships, and a host of other international issues cannot be left to market forces on their own, which was the dogma and the mantra of the 1980s and 90s. The market forces need to be used in environmental policy, trade and currency and so on, but they have to be managed and redirected by explicit political decisions. One of the lessons of the crisis is that markets are extremely effective in responding to price incentives by creating new products, services, technologies, or indeed whole new industries, when they see the incentives for them. But markets can't always be trusted to create incentives that reflect broader social interests, be they financial stability, environmental sustainability, energy independence, or social equality and harmony. So in the new version of capitalism that's emerging, therefore politics will play a larger role in setting incentives to which private enterprise in competitive markets will then have to respond. And I think one has to give credit to our government here, and George Osborne in particular, that he seems to have caught on to that in a vague sort of way. So, some of the examples that haven't happened yet but are being discussed are, carbon trading, energy pricing. But one of the things that's happened, I think, very impressively is the growing willingness of our government here to intervene in wage setting, in the wage setting market. And recognition that is actually creating market incentives or market using market mechanisms to drive up wages which are too low for a socially acceptable level of survival in our society, is actually a very effective way of combining the requirements of politics with the effectiveness of markets. But before you accuse me of simply wanting to turn the clock back to the 1960s, I just want to finish by emphasizing that history does only move in one direction. So we can't just return to the Keynesian golden age of the 60s because, as I said before, the era of government knows best blew up just as spectacularly in the 1970s and early 80s as the era of market fundamentalism did in 2008. So just as we can't trust markets always to create the right incentives, we can't trust politicians arguing until midnight in smoke-filled rooms. So where does that lead us? Well, just to end on a somewhat optimistic note, I feel that despite all the long-run worries, we mustn't forget the megatrends that I mentioned right at the beginning, which drove the boom that preceded the bust. The 3 billion new producers and consumers in the world economy, the extraordinary advances in internet and communication technology, the unification of the whole global system in one market economy, which, as I said at the start, is the worst system of running economics except for all the others. Those events which led to this boom have not been reversed by the bust. They have their influence has gone into abeyance while we are still grappling for a way of reconciling the post-crisis reality with the ideas about economic management and politics, most of which still date back to 20, 30, or 40 years before. But judging by the experience of the previous crises, it took 7, 10, 15 years for a new consensus to emerge about in the 1920s and 1930s, again in the 1970s and 1980s, for a new consensus to emerge about how best to reconcile the requirements of the political system with the operations of the economy, how to balance, both economics and politics are essentially they're systems of, social decision-making. politics is one man, one vote. Economics is £1, one vote. And both of them have important and essential virtues. And as I say, judging by the experience of the last systemic crises, it takes between 7 years and 2 decades for a new balance to emerge. I certainly hope, but I actually do think also objectively that we're actually closer to that now than we were 3 or 4 years ago. And looking at trends around the world, at least, and I'm not talking here about the Middle East, of course, which we can come back to, it seems likely to me that both America and Europe and also Japan, and at least the other advanced economies, are moving towards this new model of capitalism that I'm talking about. Maybe I should stop.